Good afternoon. Today we will focus on Turkey-Russia relations, considering the past, current developments, and of course the future, and the positioning of the Western countries against the latest rapprochement between Turkey and Russia. We have today two guests, Michael Reynolds and Evren Balta. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Evren Balta is a senior scholar at the Istanbul Policy Center and associate professor of international relations at Özyeğin University. Michael Reynolds is associate professor of Near Eastern Studies and director of the program in Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies at Princeton University. I would like to begin with Professor Balta. Last week, there was a conference on Turkey-Russia relations at the Istanbul Policy Center, and you held a speech, and you as well. How was the event?
The event went very well. It was a very crowded event. Before the event, actually, we organized another roundtable with the participation of Michael Reynolds and Fyodor Lukyanov from Russia. And in that event, we first started by discussing the role of Russia in global politics, which we titled Reassessing the Russian Role in Global Politics. And then in the second day, we had a full-day conference on Russian-Turkish relations. This time we basically focused on the bilateral relations between these two countries, but we took into the consideration of the role of the Western countries play in this bilateral relationship. The conference was organized by Istanbul Policy Center and also Istanbul Developmental Foundation, İKV. And when we decided to do this conference together with İKV and İPM, approximately like 3 or 4 months ago, we thought that this topic was topical because there was a lot of cooperation going on between these two countries sometimes at the expense of Turkey's relationship with the West. And then when we actually did the conference, things were radically changing, specifically with regard to the developments in Idlib. And it became even more topical, but now not because of the cooperation between these two countries, but the possibility of a conflict between these countries over Syria, over Idlib. So that was the basic broad general framework, and that's why we decided to do the conference. You wanted me to talk a little bit about the program? What we discussed? Okay. In the full day, we had 3 panels. The first panel was on the history. We tried to understand the patterns of cooperation and conflict between these two countries by looking at history. We covered the last 2 decades, basically, starting from the 19th century. Michael Reynolds was one of the speakers in that panel, and our panelists tried to help us. I mean, they basically helped us to understand how the cooperation has evolved between these two countries and how and what would be the lessons, historical lessons, if we look at the last 2 decades. Maybe we can talk about that later because I thought that it was a fascinating discussion. One of the major things that I learned in that panel, and I was moderating the panel, was basically the cooperation that developed between Russia and Turkey, between the Soviet Union and Turkey throughout the Cold War, and how strong it was. And this was very important because it really goes against the tail of this non-relationship between Turkey and Russia. And in the second panel, we basically shifted our focus to bilateral relations. We focused on energy deals, energy cooperation, economic ties and cooperation. We questioned this idea of compartmentalization a lot, which became very dominant again in understanding Russian-Turkish relations. We then moved on to Russia's soft power, whether Russia uses this hybrid warfare in Turkey, as it is claimed to be using elsewhere in Europe, in the US interfering US elections. And we also focused on the security cooperation, specifically the purchase of S-400s and military, arms deals between Russia and Turkey, and how can we make sense of these arms deals, whether it's in the national interest of Turkey or something else. In the last panel, we brought another actor to the picture, which we thought fundamental to understand Russian-Turkish relations, which was the West. We tried to understand the role of the EU. We tried to understand the role of the American foreign policy and maybe the mistakes that are basically done by the Western actors, especially in Syria, and also their dealings with Turkey, with the Turkish government. And we also questioned whether these two actors, Russia and Turkey, are becoming normative contestants of the emerging or the world order, and they are the emerging actors, emerging normative actors. And if they are the emerging normative actors, what is the basis of this claim? We try to understand that as well. So I think that's pretty much the summary of the event.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Reynolds, you were one of the speakers of the conference, as we mentioned, and the session in which you had a speech had a title like, "Can Russian and Turkish relations escape history?" What does escaping history mean?
Oh, I could say a lot of words about that. I actually started my presentation yesterday, I think, pointing out there were two things I wanted to question about that title. One is sort of a notion there that history is something that we need to escape from in general. And you find this is, I think, a powerful stream in, I would say, kind of Western liberal thinking, sort of what lies behind the EU. Sort of history is seen as a bad thing and something we need to transcend. Which I have, I don't agree with. I don't think history is our problem so much as human nature. And then the question is, how do we? I think it's a mistake to try to imagine that you can totally avoid conflict. And the better question is to ask how can you better manage conflict? Leaving that aside, more specifically on relations between Turkey and Russia, the assumption, default assumption in everybody's minds, I think, is that Turkey and Russia are two countries who have been at loggerheads throughout history, that they've been bitter rivals, and there's certainly a great deal of evidence for that. But that gets exaggerated, I think, in the oversimplified view, which incidentally happens to be, I think, a common one among many Americans who assume that Russia and Turkey are by nature hostile to each other, and therefore any kind of rapprochement between Turkey and Russia could never last. And the idea is this was going to break up sooner or later, which it may, because I believe actually there are fundamental differences between the two countries, but there are also very important periods of cooperation between the two, and we should not overlook that, for better or for worse. Better in the idea that always generally speaking, cooperation is better than conflict. But for worse, from the American perspective, if there's robust Turkish-Russian cooperation, Americans fear that will be at the expense of Turkish-American cooperation.
Mm-hmm. How do you see the historical perspective in terms of, do you see the fluctuations in history in terms of relations between Turkey and Russia, or a more straight one?
Well, obviously there has been, as Turkey had a lot of fluctuations with its relationship with the US, with the Western countries. Turkey, even in the Ottoman Empire and Russian Empire in the 19th century, Turkey and the Soviet Union in the 20th century, they had many fluctuations, many ups and downs in their relationships. We basically asked why in the first conference. How can we explain this patterns of conflict and cooperation, ups and downs? And as Dr. Reynolds mentioned, we focused on two basic elements. Really this shared bitterness of these two states against the Western dictated international order, be it in the beginning of the 20th century or in the Cold War in the 1960s, and even now, really made them to cooperate more. This was one of the incentives of those two states to work together, to balance the West, or to reassert their position in global politics. This was one of the dynamics that, or the factors that really shaped this ups and downs. For example, when Turkey had better relations with the West, and when the Turkish government, Ankara government, felt that it was being backed up by the Western governments, specifically in its security sensitivities, I would say, then they had less of incentive to cooperate with Russia, although the cooperation was still there in terms of economy, in terms of energy, but in terms of security cooperation, now I'm talking less of an incentive to cooperate with Russia. And the second one is basically related to this aspect. Turkey and Russia had conflicting interests in the region. They are both ambitious states, and sometimes their ambition is increases.
When saying region,
I mean, Russia is more like a global power, but Turkey has more like regional ambitions, and sometimes these regional ambitions of these two states really do not go along together well. We see this in the case of Syria, we see this in the case of Libya, we saw this in the 1990s in Central Asia, in Caucasus, in Balkans as well. So they both want to be increase their influence in this wider region. So they have this conflictual dynamics. So when they become more assertive in that sense regionally, they're basically more, I mean, the possibility of conflict increases, I would say. And that's another dimension to understand these ups and downs. And the third dimension would be both states have different understandings of what an internal security threat is. This is sometimes not really in parallel. I mean, for Turkey, you can see this dynamic in work in Syria. For Turkey, it's the Kurdish question, and which really goes back to Turkey's being jealous of its borders, its sensitivity about its territorial integrity. Then you have, like this idea of I mean, if I go back to the Syria, transnationalization of the Kurdish question. And in the case of Russia, it's basically, especially more recently, what you see is the internal security threat is basically related to the Islamic Jihad, the role of Islamist elements in this wider region and how to control that. And in that perspective, we can talk about this later on as well, but in that perspective, their security perceptions are a bit conflictual. And Turkey and Russia can only cooperate when they really resolve this issue of how to see who the threat is, the real threat is. And when they resolve this issue, they don't have to resolve it completely. When they come to an understanding that they need each other in order to resolve these issues, then they cooperate more. And this was the case in the past as well. For example, in the 1990s, they couldn't really resolve the issue of the Chechens versus Kurds, and it was more of a conflictual period. So these three dynamics really, I think this is not, a lesson that I'm taking from the conference only, but I think these three dynamics are really important.
Especially 1990s, Central Asia was also a problematic point, I think.
Turkey becoming the model country. Yes. Someone said in the conference, Turkey was the West, not just, which I find quite interesting.
Okay. Mr. Reynolds, how do you evaluate the latest cooperation or approachment between Turkey and Russia in recent years? Is it a temporary thing, or are there any similarities in the history?
Just to pick up where we're off, I would totally agree that the really remarkable thing I find about Turkish-Russian relations over the course of, let's say, the past 5 years or so, is how the ambitions of these two states are at loggerheads. They're in opposition to each other, much more than they are compatible with each other. In particular, in Syria, Turkey desired, like the United States, desired the overthrow of Assad and his regime, whereas Russia was committed to that. They are at loggerheads in Libya, and these are two flashpoints that are really quite, their interests are directly opposed to each other and are quite conflictual. And then there are others, such as Crimea. One can look to the Caucasus. Still, Turkey tilts towards Azerbaijan. Armenia is a close ally of Russia. So there are many, many different points where, in fact, one looks at the interests of the two countries and they are opposed to each other. And, of course, we even had the incident where Turkey shot down a Russian jet. So there's a lot that there's a big mystery here. Why is it that Turkey and Russia, the perception that they are getting along, which is I think, well, I should say they are getting along. We don't know what's going on day to day. A great deal could change if there is going to be, we can't exclude the possibility of actually armed conflict going on between the Turkish armed forces and the Russian in Syria right now. But despite all this tension between the two, the relations are not bad, and there is even a certain sympathy between Moscow and Ankara. And of course, the best example of this is the purchase of the S-400s from Russia. And so the question is, what explains this? And I think here the explanation relates both Moscow and Ankara agree that their most important, greatest threat is the United States. Well, I say different reasons. One could say, well, rather than get into those reasons right now, I'll just say that they both see the United States as their primary threat, and therefore this is what's underlying the cooperation. And here's where, in some of the things I've written, I've pointed out that one always has to be careful about comparing contemporary events to historical ones. In trying to draw too many direct parallels, but I am struck by the parallel between the recent past and that of the, I guess you might call it the independence, post-World War I period in Turkish history, when Mustafa Kemal, in fighting the war for independence, reached out to Vladimir Lenin. This was his first act in the international stage and established an alliance which enabled the establishment of the Turkish Republic. And it's the one great example of this, how important this was, is if you go to Taksim and you look at the monument to the Republic, and who's the one foreigner there? It's the Soviet ambassador standing behind Mustafa Kemal. And I believe that was in 1928. I think that statue was done. So it was after that struggle, not during it, but not so long after that that the struggle had been forgotten. So I think that is telling. And what drove relations between the two countries back then was the perception that the British, first and foremost, and secondarily the French and the other Western imperial powers, were again the primary threats to the Bolshevik Russia and to Mustafa Kemal. And likewise, I think one thing that's very common in the West today, in the United States, is to try to explain Turkish-Russian relations as a function of shared authoritarianism, which I don't buy that argument. I don't agree with it. I think it's much too facile. And it's similar if someone tried to argue, well, Lenin and Mustafa Kemal, they looked to each other because they were both authoritarian figures. That doesn't explain the relations back then, and likewise, I don't think that there's any kind of shared affinity explains Erdogan's and Putin's cooperation. Again, could someone try to explain the long history of wars between the Russian czars and Ottoman sultans by any ideological, they had a great deal more in common ideologically than they did from this perspective of authoritarianism. I find geopolitical explanations to be far more powerful, and I think it's sort of a lazy and self-indulgent one to point to the personalities involved and to this idea, well, simply they aren't the kind of Democrats that we would prefer, and therefore this explains it. I think Americans have to be much more self-critical if they're to improve in, their policies.
Okay.
Can I just comment on this?
Of course.
I mean, I do agree that it is a very simplistic explanation to look at the regime type of both these countries and see that there is a similarity, and the similarity drives them together. But on the other hand, as we discussed in the conference, if you look at the S-400 decision, for example, which became really the symbol of Turkey's drift from the Euro-Atlantic Alliance or the Western Alliance, you see the role of the leaders or the emergence of leaders who are not locked in by public or bureaucratic pressures. And as one of our panelists have explained us about the decision of S-400s, that there were no institutional ownership of the decision, and the decision was basically a result of the institutionalization of the Turkish foreign policy. So at the macro level, maybe it's not, about, like the similarity of these two regimes, but when you look at the geopolitical decisions and how they are made, they're closely connected, how the decisions are made as a result of the changes in this regime, more leadership-oriented, more personalized, more centralized, a lot of the institutionalization going on. So maybe we should just, not focusing on the similarity, but focusing on how this macro-political changes transform the decision-making environment in these countries, and that is what matters most than the similarity, maybe.
Now I would like to talk about the current, very current developments, Idlib or Syria or Middle East. Do you see a threat between Russia and Turkey to militarily clash or not? Or how do you see the latest developments?
I wish I could say that let me put it this way. I think the possibility of a clash again between Turkish and the Russian militaries is all too possible. I'm not going to say I'm going to predict that. I don't think either side wants that. But it's so complex in Syria that I don't think anyone can exclude that. Whether the two Turkish soldiers the other day had been killed. From some reports I saw that there was Russian airstrikes that did it, and I'd seen other. There's so many, because there's so many actors inside of Syria. There is the Russian military. There's the Syrian, the forces of the Syrian government. Attached to those are various militias, some backed by Iran. Then you have a whole plethora of groups backed by Turkey, ranging from very unsavory jihadist groups to others. And all of these, one could imagine having a stake in wanting to provoke one side or the other. Anything, I think, could happen because, again, you have so many forces in close proximity to each other, in which one might also say the Americans being in there. When the Americans were on patrol not that long ago, and there was some conflict with both Syrian armed forces, with Russians. All too easy to imagine some sort of collision on the road. Shooting could start.
The question, as I asked, is also for you. How do you evaluate the latest situation in Syria?
Possibility of a clash. It's already happening, I guess. And also, I'm a political scientist by training, and when we try to understand the emergence of wars, we basically say that it's not the intentions of the actors, not always. It's not the rational, calculated outcome. Wars do not happen as a result of, the strategic plan, long-term plans of the actors, and sometimes they do happen as a result of accidents, miscalculation, misperception, and I do see that a lot of miscalculation and misperception going on in Syria right now. And that's true for all sides, for Syria, for Russia, for Turkey. They do a lot of miscalculation, misperception, and the environment, the climate is really open to major accidents, and it's happening right now. And I do see that there is a possibility of escalation, even more. But I still do hope that because Turkey and Russia still need each other in the resolution of the Syrian situation, I do hope that the conflict at some point will freeze, or it's going to be more of it will reach a certain point, it will freeze there for a certain period of time, and then probably then there could be another escalation. It's not going to be resolved soon because the interests, as we discussed in the beginning of this program, the interests of both Russia, Assad, and Turkey are very different right now. They basically really sidelined those interests in the last 2 years, 3 years after 2016 with the Sochi and Astana processes, but it's coming up right now, and it's not really easy to contain. Here the fact is that the Russian side has been clear about what it wants for Syria, to get back the territory as much as possible prior to the Syrian conflict and the territorial integrity of the Syrian state, and also keep the Assad in power. But for Turkey, and it's again a normative contestation, they say that we have to keep Syria intact. And in the case of Turkey, however, it's not clear whether Turkey is after territorial integrity of Syria. When it comes to Kurds, Turkey underlines, emphasizes the importance of territorial integrity, no autonomy within Syria. But also it tries, when it comes to the opposition, it seems that, and I think that's what the problem is with Russia, Turkey wants an autonomous territory for the opposition. And when you come back to the Russian side, it's not about, and we can discuss this later on as well, for Russia, it's not about only the radical Islamic jihadists. If you look at Russia's past military campaigns, for example, in Chechnya, the target is always moderates because they are the ones who legitimize internationally the presence of autonomy or the insurgency, this and that. So there is no moderate or radical Islam / they're all the same in the case of Russia. So they really don't want this autonomous zone for the moderates. And that is a real important difference between Turkey and Russia, because Turkey has been working with the moderate political forces since 2013 to 2012, since the start of the Syrian conflict. I think it's very difficult to resolve this issue.
We have many points and time is running very fast, so let's talk about some Western side, especially American side. How does American side see the relations between Turkey and Russia, this approachment, and in general Turkish-American relations?
I think, again, I think I made this point at the beginning. Many Americans, I think, thought that there's no way that Turkey and Russia could really have any sort of rapprochement, and that even when Erdogan was in negotiations to buy the S-400s and was insisting, I'm really going to do this, my impression is that the key American decision makers, policymakers, thought, well, this is just a bluff. He's really not going to do this. This is sort of unthinkable. And Americans were genuinely surprised when, lo and behold, the S-400 missiles were delivered. And then, of course, the day that they were delivered happened to be the day, I guess, would you call it the anniversary of the July 15th, 2016 failed putsch or failed coup, which was highly symbolic in the message to Americans. So I think America certainly has been worried by the rapprochement and has also been confused, and to this day doesn't really quite know what to make of it. There is a great deal, I shouldn't say a great deal, but there is excitement among some parts of the American establishment that see the possibility of a clash between Russia and Turkey. There is a clash taking place between Russia and Turkey in the diplomatic level, perhaps a military one. I think that this might be a way to bring Turkey back over closer to the United States, should that happen. There are many things that separate, as I was saying earlier, many points in which Russia and Turkey have very divergent interests, in fact, clashing interests. But I think that those Americans hoping that Turkey will inevitably come back to the United States and pull away from Russia they shouldn't be quite so confident.
How do you see the future of the NATO in general and the future of Turkey as a NATO member in special?
I think this is a great example of the difficulties of NATO, and this is incidentally one of the reasons why, my personal opinion was at the end of the Cold War, NATO should have been disbanded because it had served its purpose, and a new organization should have been developed to replace it. And likewise, I spoke a bit about this. I think it was the day when we had the workshop on Russian, more focused on Russian foreign policy. The effect of the war in Georgia and the fact that the United States in 2008 lost a great deal of credibility there. And it was a large defeat for the United States, which wasn't recognized by the U.S. because Georgia was so distant from the U.S. and wasn't a vital interest. And the question then being, why were we saying we plan to extend NATO membership to Georgia? Likewise, Ukraine, I believe that there too, the United States has gotten very little out of that conflict. And coming back now to Turkey, we can see here, as any chain is only as strong as its weakest links, as NATO has gotten larger and larger, I think it's actually gotten weaker. And what's taking place now with Turkey and Russia is so confused. Now, this is really involve all NATO members. If Turkey is to enter into a military clash with Russia, what would happen if Turkey requests, invokes the right of an ally to request other NATO members to defend it? And likewise, I don't know what the current status of this, the request for Patriot missiles to be deployed against Russia, because I imagine some NATO members might say, this isn't a NATO question, this is Turkey's question. This is Turkey's created its own problem in Idlib in its own effort to overthrow the Assad government, which the United States was a partner in that effort, but that wasn't, technically speaking, a NATO effort. And it now makes a very, I think, confused time for NATO. How strongly will NATO want to back Turkey? And if it doesn't back Turkey, then what does that say about NATO overall as an alliance? And given President Trump's questions about NATO, this is a very large issue. What is NATO's purpose? How strong is all these things are now very much up in the air. And that is adds another bit of instability to what's taking place in Syria. That it's not clear how important will the United States judge what's taking place in Syria, what Turkey's doing, how strongly should the United States back Turkey. Turkey might miscalculate, thinking we can stand up to the Russians because ultimately the Americans in NATO will be behind their backs. But if they're not, again, all of these things. And Russia likewise might be thinking, let's provoke something. We can provoke enough to make it clear that NATO isn't going to back Turkey, and we can deal a blow to NATO and Turkey. And they might miscalculate if, in fact, NATO does rally, if there were a clash and NATO were to rally to Turkey's side. Again, it's really a potentially very explosive situation in Syria.
This question is also for you, Professor Balta. How does the West see this approachment or cooperation between Turkey and Russia?
I basically agree with what Dr. Reynolds has said. In the beginning, if I go back to 3 years ago, it was basically thought that it was a marriage of convenience, as it was in the 1920s. It wasn't for the Western actors a strategic or a value-based relationship, and which in fact was correct. It still is not a trust-based, value-based, interest-based relationship. It is basically, as we discussed, based on needs. These two actors basically need each other in order to balance the West and the security trust that we were talking about. But over time, the perception in the West has evolved to see this relationship as a value-based relationship. not as a relationship of convenience, but because of the similarity between these two regimes, because they share so many similar features in terms of decision-making processes and this and that, they begin to think that this is an emerging alliance that is not only trying to balance the power of the West, but also try to balance the, like the value system that the West has created, growing authoritarianism, this and that, which I think the perception that was prevalent 3 or 4 years ago was more apt, actually, to see this relationship as a marriage of convenience. They needed each other. But when you see it as a relationship that's based on values, trust, very strong relationship, then the way that you deal with this relationship changes radically. And since it does not reflect the essence of this relationship, and then the West has less of, tools really to deal with this relationship. I mean, the better way is to see it more pragmatic, opportunist, and a need-based relationship.
Okay, too many points and questions to discuss, but the time is limited, so we have to wrap up. But last questions. How do you see the future of Turkish foreign policy? Are you optimistic or pessimistic in terms of a better relation with the US or the West and also the Russia? What do you think about it?
Well, I'd have to say, unfortunately, I have to say I'm pessimistic, only because the Turkish. I've been very critical of American foreign policy, particularly with regards to Turkey. But if I were also, when I think about Turkish foreign policy, there's a great deal I would criticize there. I think both the United States and Turkey made multiple mistakes inside of Syria, and Turkey has, unfortunately, again, I hate to say this, but has compounded its errors inside of Syria, and I think is continuing to do that. With its role that it's playing very dangerous one, I think, in Libya, and the fact that right now Turkey, with all its neighbors, has significant problems. So I would like to say I'm optimistic, but I don't think. I mean, one of the key things, and we were talking about perceptions and the role of that, and misperception as being a factor oftentimes in the outbreaks of war. I mean, one of the fundamental misperceptions, both in the United States and Turkey, has been sort of, I think, the refusal to recognize that Turkey and the U.S. lost the war in Syria to overthrow Assad, and the idea that, I mean, there were still people clinging very recently in the United States, so maybe we can still keep American forces inside of Syria, and there would be some way we're going to be able to overthrow Assad. Likewise, I think Turkey as well didn't quite fully understand that Assad has won this war, and the question is going to be negotiating the victory. And I don't think Erdogan has fully understood that, and which is why Idlib has emerged as this major potential flashpoint. Unless those perceptions change and Turkey begins to, I think, understand where its strengths and where its weaknesses really are, I don't see much likelihood of Turkish foreign policy improving. With regard to its relations with the West, again, I've been very critical of the U.S. Mistakes towards Turkey, but Erdogan has made the multiple mistakes. I mean, the purchase of the S-400s, as sympathetic as I am to Turkish sensitivities on this and other issues, it was just a very stupid way to signal to the U.S. we have options and we can move closer to Russia, because once you've purchased those S-400s, it is not something you can, it's an all or nothing decision. It's not one where you can say, okay, we bought a few of them, and now we're not going to buy any more, or we might buy more. It's now you've bought into this system, which is going to be inoperable with the F-35, which is a major project for the Turkish defense industry and the American, and that's going to be long-term. You have the sanctions, etc. This was a very poor choice by Erdogan of a way of signaling to the United States, because now he's stuck with these missiles that may not, are they in fact ever going to be operational? Can you really trust that they're going to be, the Russians have given you the full technology to make them operational? How are they going to be integrated with the rest of the Turkish armed forces? I mean, technical experts can answer those questions. My understanding is that this is not so easy. So that, Likewise, he's alienated, I think, a great deal of Europeans, and I share much of Turkey's. Again, there's a great deal to be said on the Turkish case, but the way that Erdogan has been, his rhetoric has been so dismissive of the Europeans. There too, I think it'd be very difficult to patch up things, and that's why I think there certainly is inside the Washington D.C. Sentiment that Turkey's made its own bed, let it lie in it, that this is their problem, and they're going to have to suffer for it. And which is short-sighted ultimately for the United States as well. But I don't yet see, I think, well, I guess I'll close with this. I think there's a growing recognition, I hope there is among Erdogan in Ankara, the people making decisions in Turkey, certainly outside of those circles there, that Turkey's in a very vulnerable position and it has made mistakes and needs to stop making them. But I don't know that really has penetrated into Erdogan's mind, and I don't know how they're thinking. How do we get out of this hole that we've dug ourselves in? I could imagine they're going to, the saying, when you're in a hole, the first thing to do is to stop digging. Lately, Turkey, though, has only continued to dig that hole, both with the United States and even with Russia. That is setting up more confrontations rather than fewer. So I'm pessimistic, unfortunately.
Okay. As I understood, you both don't take foreign policy as a personal thing, but I would like to insist on asking this question. Another president in the US, another president in Russia, or another president in Turkey can change the relations?
Well, again, let me answer by
either positive or negative.
Referring to more of a conceptual discussion. Personalities matter. I mean, leadership personality of the leaders really make a lot of sense in understanding foreign policy decisions, but to some extent. I mean, there is a lot of structural changes happening in the international environment as well, and also within Turkey, which is going to be not that easy to reverse. Structurally, in the conference, someone used this explanation of what's happening. I mean, when trying to explain what's happening for Turkey and Russia, and it was something like this. Both these countries wanted to have a seat on the table, but then the table collapsed. So we're basically talking about Westerlessness. So the West as the normative hook of the Turkish foreign policy disappeared, and it's not going to come back. This makes a lot of sense, and it won't change when the leaders will change, right? I mean, there is definitely room. I mean, there's a lot going to change, positive or negative, that I cannot really speculate on that. But you have this structural thing going on, and also a lot of transactionalism happening, not just for Turkey, for the European countries as well. It's not, again, anymore an institution-based, value-based relationship. For many of the countries, international politics has become transactional, including the US. And Turkey is in this tendency as well. It's basically using the similar tools the Western states are using when dealing with other states. And also within Turkey, a lot of the institutionalization happened, which, if I go back to your question, makes possible that the leadership change would change the foreign policy, may change the foreign policy radically. Because if you have strong institutions, then those institutions really resist, or they have identities, as we discussed in the conference. For example, the institutions of Cold War are still there in the U.S. and they do resist to change and transformation. But in Turkey, a lot of the institutionalization happened. That may help us to explain leadership, the relationship between leadership change and also foreign policy change. But overall, as I said, the structural environment of the foreign policy making has changed radically in the last decade or so.
Michael Reynolds, Evren Balta, thank you very much for joining us today. We discussed today the relations between Turkey and Russia, considering the West and especially the US. Thank you very much for watching us, and see you next time.